So, there is a very good reason why apologists love to give Dr. Bart Ehrman and other scholars like him as much attention as they do. And recently, Jimmy Akin laid this reason out plain as day.
Bart, the skeptic, agrees the Gospels are probably right about all these major claims, all these intermediate claims, and all these lesser claims. And that's quite a lot. I would say that this is enough to judge the Gospels historically reliable.
Sometimes, Dr. Bart Ehrman argues more like an apologist than he does a historian or a textual critic, especially when it comes to historical facts about Jesus or his historicity. So, if y'all want to fuck around and find out exactly how much Dr. Bart Ehrman refutes Dr. Bart Ehrman, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, I want to do an in-depth analysis of Dr. Bart Ehrman when he's arguing against the resurrection or gospel reliability, and then compare and contrast that with his anti-mythicist position. He seems to argue two totally different ways depending on the context. You see, on the topics of the resurrection or gospel reliability, he argues much like a historian or textual critic. But when the context switches to mythicism or the historicity of Jesus, he starts arguing like an apologist. Let's start with Dr. Bart Ehrman's first line of defense against the mythicist argument, highlighted by this particular clip from his recent interview with Seth Andrews.
We know the apologist is going to rest most of what he says about the resurrection, the topic of the debate, on the assumption that there was a literal Jesus, right?
Well, yeah, and I think he's absolutely right. I mean, there was. So I know this is a debate on the internet, but when you first said the question about the historical Jesus, I didn't expect you to go there because, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, it's not a debated issue in scholarship.
It's not debated, though. I mean, it's not like I have a dog in this fight.
No, it's not. No, it's not debated.
Did you notice how Bart just started chanting no at Seth when Seth brings up the fact that Jesus' historicity is being debated in the scholarship? Simply put, this is called thought stopping. Primarily, Bart uses the consensus of scholars in order to stop people from thinking deeper about the historicity of Jesus. Seth is correct, by the way. 2 peer-reviewed monographs have been published by academic publishers, one defending an agnostic position on Jesus' historicity, and the other going full-on with the minimal mythicist argument. That alone makes mythicism a topic that is currently being debated in the scholarly community. There are a couple of problems with Bart's constant appeals to authority. First, we know that Bart doesn't think that this argument proves that Jesus is historical, because Bart himself tells us so.
Bill constantly quotes modern scholars as if somehow that constitutes evidence for his point of view. As Bill himself knows, the fact that the majority of New Testament scholars would agree with his 4 points is not proof that they are right.
That I hope that you all, as we say where I live, you all, I hope you all realize that expert opinion is opinion. Mike's opinions are his opinions, my opinions are my opinions, the people he quoted are their opinions. Opinions are not evidence. Expert opinions are not evidence.
Just like my now saying that no scholar debates this. I mean, I'm not trying to prove it that Jesus existed. I'm just saying, that's not so.
So, what are we left to conclude from the fact that Bart consistently brings up the argument from consensus when discussing the historical Jesus, yet he does not consider it to be evidence that Jesus existed? Seems to me like he reaches for this particular argument in an attempt to shut down the conversation before it can really get started, because then he's put in the precarious position of defending the historicity of Jesus. This is evident by the fact that a good number of people that I engage with on this particular topic simply can't answer me with anything other than the consensus. When I talked to Captain Dadpole, he couldn't think of any reason to reject mythicism other than it's a minority position. We started out this with you thinking that mythicists just sort of dismiss things. And I'm wondering if through our conversation, do you feel like I've just dismissed anything without reason?
I don't know if without reason is the best word. It's more like you have to cling to more fringe ideas in order to make them work, if that makes sense.
Like what fringe idea have I espoused?
Just
Other
that
than Jesus didn't exist.
just that Jesus was not actually born of a woman. He didn't actually, like, he was a fleshly being, but he was created in the firmament. Things like that almost no scholar is going to agree with.
I would need a citation for that no scholar would agree with that.
Almost no scholar. You're going to find scholars that are going to agree with you, no matter what. You could, again, there are atheist flat earthers. You're going to be able to find a scholar who agrees with you.
So why does it matter?
Because there's always going to be people out there who want to cling to fringe theories.
No. I mean, like, why does it matter that almost no scholar would agree with those interpretations of things, even though they're literally in, like, documents that are in the Bible and
because
stuff?
Because if it was an idea that was worth entertaining, more people would entertain it.
Oh, and here's a random caller that espouses the exact same position. I'm very different from most atheists, I guess, on this particular question.
Right. Even though the majority consensus is that they somehow do have proof, whether they're religious or not, but they don't have proof, but I mean, they have reason to believe that he existed more than reason to believe that he did not exist. You still don't believe that he existed?
Even within the conversation between Seth Andrews and Dr. Bart Ehrman, Ehrman reluctantly offers to go into the evidence for historical Jesus, but Seth prefers to change the subject, which, mind you, is the entire goal of bringing up the consensus. As a viewer, this communicates to me that the argument from consensus is enough to dispel the whole question of historicity to begin with. And again, this is reflected by the pervasiveness of this argument in this particular discussion. Now, the second issue with the argument from consensus in this particular context is highlighted by Dr. Bart Ehrman himself.
The fact that the majority of New Testament scholars would agree with his 4 points is not proof that they are right. For one thing, the majority of New Testament scholars are believers in the New Testament. That is, they're theologically committed to the text. So of course they agree on these points.
So, Dr. Ehrman astutely pointed out that most New Testament scholars would affirm that the resurrection is a historical event. That makes a historical resurrection the consensus of all scholars directly working in that field, and subsequently makes the ahistorical position on the resurrection the fringe position. And if you think, oh, well, that clip was a long time ago, so Ehrman might have changed his position. Nope. Here's a clip from his most recent debate with Mike Licona, where he affirms the exact same position.
I think he's completely wrong. I think the consensus of New Testament scholars would say Jesus was raised from the dead. Because the vast majority of New Testament scholars are Christians. I mean, I'm an odd duck.
All of this highlights the problem that most scholars that are invested in the historical Jesus question are Christians that are either theologically or contractually committed to the religion. Therefore, their conclusions cannot be trusted because they are affected by their dogmatic bias towards their own religion. And Dr. Bart Ehrman would agree with me on this point as well. Not only that most scholars invested in this question are theologically committed Christians, but that this negatively affects their conclusions. Recently, he interacted with Tim McGrew and espouse this very fact.
I'm having trouble believing you don't have a view about inerrancy.
My view of inerrancy is that I'm weary of it.
I mean, what's your
what's the motivation behind this, Bart? Is
I
it
just want to
that
know-
you think that if someone does hold theologically, say, to a view of inerrancy, then that must impact the way they therefore do their historical research?
My view is that a person's assumptions about the Bible are going to affect how they approach the Bible.
Often, Bart suggests that no historian whatsoever will take the mythicist position or teaches the mythicist position. The problem with that statement is that unless a historian is working directly in the field of historical Jesus studies, then that scholar is going to use the consensus of historical Jesus studies. And that always leads back to the majority of New Testament scholars being theologically committed to their faith. And regardless of the route that you go with this argument, you are always led back to the dogmatically Christian-controlled consensus of New Testament studies. So, we have established that appealing to a consensus amongst primarily Christian scholars that are theologically committed to their faith is not going to give us sound conclusions. Yet, Dr. Bart Ehrman uses the consensus of these very scholars in order to stop the conversation of Jesus' historicity. If these scholars are theologically committed to the resurrection of a dead Jew in the first century, how can we expect them to take a critical and honest look at the evidence for a historical Jesus? We can't, but Bart wants you to, so what ends up happening? The anti-resurrection Dr. Bart Ehrman refutes the anti-mythicist Dr. Bart Ehrman.
You know, but the mythicists always get angry at me because I point out that there's nobody, there's no university or college professor in the country who's an expert in this. And there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of, and they're not just all fundamentalist Christians. I mean, they're people like me and who just
realize that expert opinion is opinion. Mike's opinions are his opinions, my opinions are my opinions, the people he quoted are their opinions. Opinions are not evidence. Expert opinions are not evidence.
To Bart Ehrman's credit, whenever he discusses the argument from consensus, he usually has a small caveat that indicates that it's not evidence. But he has to have this particular caveat because a majority of scholars working on the resurrection agree that it was historical. It's almost like he saw how powerful this thought-stopping rhetoric was, and so he uses it whenever it benefits him against mythicism. So, since Bart doesn't consider the consensus argument to be evidence for a historical Jesus, but only uses it in order to stop the conversation before it can even start, what does Bart consider to be evidence for a historical Jesus?
The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources.
What would you say is the best evidence that you can think of for the historical Jesus?
Okay. Well, it's kind of hard to pick the best evidence because there's lots of evidence. We have numerous look, Jesus is the best documented figure from the first century in Judea in terms of external evidence. There's nobody else that you have 4 biographies written of.
Well, his second line of defense seems to be a generalized statement about multiple early attestation of a historical Jesus. That would be great! So, what are these multiple early attestations of Jesus?
So, do these sources, Q, M, and L, do they represent independent oral traditions that go back to the historical Jesus, to his time?
Probably. When we were earlier talking about the different sources, one of the values of recognizing you've got different sources is that if there was an M and there was a Q and there was a Mark and there was definitely a Mark and there these other sources, you can count, and you've got these John sources and things. You can look at all of them, and if they aren't relying on each other and they have similar material in them, the similar material has to predate all of the sources, and the more sources you got saying it, the more likely it's an early date. And so, like in all these sources, Mark, Q, M, and L, you have sayings of Jesus predicting that the end is going to come soon. And you also have multiply attested in these independent sources, Jesus predicting that when God destroys the forces of evil, it's going to include a destruction of the temple.
Well, these are all hypothetical sources that don't physically exist at all. They're not explicitly referenced by anybody, nor are they explicitly quoted. You see, Christian biblical scholars have perceived there to be a problem with the synoptic gospels, commonly called the synoptic problem. And to fix this problem, they have hypothesized sources to explain where the gospel writers got their information. Normally, this is a really good first step in any analysis. But the problem is that they seem to stop at hypothesis and then begin to relay the hypothesis as proven fact. In Questioning the Historicity of Jesus, Raphael the Taster has this to say about Ehrman's approach. According to proper and competent historians who do their jobs adequately, sources do need to be scrutinized, and no influential mainstream historian has ever granted a free pass to non-existing sources, unlike Ehrman and his fellow biblical scholars. As would be expected, not a single credible historian outside of biblical scholarship relies so uncritically on hypothetical sources. Raphael the Taster, Questioning the Historicity of Jesus, pages 60 and 61. And Bart does know the counter-arguments for these hypothetical sources. Simply put, Luke borrowed and adapted from both Matthew and Mark. But he rejects this idea for the lamest of reasons.
Matthew also has a lot of stuff that's not found in Mark or Luke. So it's not from Q, it's not from Mark. And so scholars have just a long time called that his M material, M for Matthew, Matthew's special source. It might be like a single document, but I doubt it. I bet that it's probably a bunch of documents, probably or oral traditions he's heard. It's possible he just made some of the stuff up. I don't know, but there's like almost nothing to suggest that, in the sense that the stories that you find in what's called M are shaped the same way that these other stories are, and these other stories look like they come from written source. So it looks like M's probably a written source, and the same with L. And it either came from somewhere, or these guys are just making it up. And it's possible they were making it up, but as I said, the stories are told in a way that are so much like the stories they're getting from written sources that have been based on oral traditions, that almost certainly these are also based on oral traditions. And so whether they come to them in written form or oral form is hard to tell, but they definitely are earlier sources. And I don't think I know any scholars who believe that Matthew and Luke are just making those ones up.
It's really weird to hear him say that nobody believes that the gospel authors were fabricating information when he himself has made this exact argument in previous debates with Mike Licona, Dan Wallace, and Jimmy Akin.
Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody. Who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. They improved the stories sometimes. They changed the stories sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down. What happens to oral reports in circulation year after year, decade after decade? They get changed.
There was no one there at the time of Jesus' death taking notes. The stories, many of them were actually invented. Most of the stories were in fact changed.
These authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living many years after the fact. They're telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. There was nobody there taking notes. Some of the stories were invented, many were changed. For this reason, these accounts are not as useful as historians would like as historical sources.
These Gospels are all different from one another in their details. Are they the kind of sources that historians would rely upon for historical information? I would argue that, in fact, these are not the kinds of sources that can be relied upon by historians.
If Matthew and Luke are not, they don't agree about the virgin birth. One of them's making stuff up or getting information from somebody who made stuff up, or they both are.
The question is, can we trust that we really know what was in the original copies of Mark and the other books of the New Testament? Dan wants to label me as a radical skeptic, and I'm simply saying that we have no evidence. If he thinks that there is evidence, I want to know what the evidence is.
So, during debates on resurrection, Dr. Bart Ehrman asserts that the sources that the Gospels used were told, retold, and subsequently changed so much to the point where they are now historically unreliable. But when it comes to the historicity of Jesus, they all of a sudden become reliable enough to establish that a person existed. How does this make sense? Arbitrarily assuming that Luke and Matthew didn't fabricate any of their information just because it looks copied is an ad hoc assumption. Accepting hypothetical sources using ad hoc reasoning over a more reasonable, less ad hoc explanation is something that Dr. Bart Ehrman normally would not do. And we have proof of this. Just listen to this discussion between Bart and Tim McGrew, where they discuss the hypothetical sources that establish a traditional authorship for the Gospels.
Tim started out by saying that there is extensive external evidence for the ascriptions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. My response was, no, there's not. And in my response, I said that the first time it's explicitly mentioned is Irenaeus. You replied by saying, well, there might have been earlier people who said this, that we've lost all of their writings because we've lost 85% of the writings. That's true. We might have. But you're the one who's claiming that there's early extensive evidence. I'm simply saying that there's not.
So basically, in that clip, we have Dr. Bart Ehrman rejecting this idea that hypothetical sources prove that the Gospels were always associated with the traditional authors. Apologists like Tim propose these hypothetical sources in order to fill perceived or actual holes in the evidence in order to make their arguments work. This is similar to Bart appealing to the Q, M, and L sources in order to explain Jesus' existence. The main problem with hypothetical sources is that we do not have them in order to critically analyze them. So Bart building his entire case on hypothetical information that we cannot know is seriously faulty. That information just simply isn't found in the evidence. He is claiming that we have extensive external evidence of Jesus' historicity, and I'm just simply saying that there's not. So what we end up having is contradictory information coming from Bart Ehrman, where we can literally have Bart Ehrman refute Bart Ehrman.
Jesus is by far the best documented person from first century Israel. There's nobody even close. He's far better documented than Josephus. Why not deny Josephus existed? He's better sorry.
There was no one there at the time of Jesus' death taking notes. The stories, many of them were actually invented. Most of the stories were in fact changed. These Gospels are all different from one another in their details. Are they the kind of sources that historians would rely upon for historical information? I would argue that in fact these are not the kinds of sources that can be relied upon by historians.
But it doesn't stop there, because Bart doesn't only do this with the Q, M, and L sources. He also does this with other hypothetical information as it suits his needs. For instance, when it comes to the Testimonium Flavianum, he constantly asserts that it's only a partial interpolation.
And so what it looks like is that Josephus had this statement about Jesus and the things he did, and some scribe whomped it up a little bit, like scribes do. Christian scribes are doing this with their own Bibles, but they certainly did it with Josephus. There was a man, and then the scribe added, well, if you could call him a man, because he was the Messiah. And so the scribe is adding in a few lines. Not whole lines, just like little statements.
This is hypothetical information, which in any other situation, Ehrman would definitely reject as being evidence. And there is mounting evidence against the idea that any other version of the Testimonium Flavianum has ever existed. Alice Wheatley has shown us that the only version that has ever existed, for all we know, is Eusebius's version that has all of the highly Christianized phrases in it. All the counter-arguments to total interpolation require you changing the literal words on the page in order to make them sound more Josephan, and so it becomes a circular argument. I mean, sure, the changed version of the Testimonium Flavianum sounds Josephan, because you made it to sound Josephan. Again, Bart building his case on hypothetical information that we cannot know is seriously faulty. And do you recall Ehrman saying this?
And some scribe whomped it up a little bit, like scribes do. Christian scribes are doing this with their own Bibles, but they certainly did it with Josephus.
Ironically enough, Ehrman seems to forget about this little tidbit whenever he analyzes the James passage in Josephus.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of theories about this, and I would say that just on the most simple terms, the best evidence that this is not an interpolation, but it's something Josephus actually wrote, is because if a Christian interpolated that, they would not have said Jesus, who is called the Christ. They would have said Jesus, who is the Christ. So that suggests that it's somebody who does not believe Jesus is the Messiah who wrote it, and that would be Josephus.
Here, Ehrman seems to totally disregard basic textual criticism that would highlight the who was called Christ as being a possible interpolation. Being a textual critic, you would think that he would know that the phrase who was called Christ looks eerily similar to other marginal notes that exist. His whole idea that a Christian interpolating that would make it sound more Christian doesn't make a lot of sense. Considering that this was probably an accidental interpolation, why would a Christian correct a Jew's writing to make it sound more Christian? If it is an interpolation, we should expect the Christian scribe to correct it in a way that resembles Josephine language. Ehrman's reliance on hypothetical information doesn't just plague one or two of his arguments, it plagues his entire case for the historical Jesus.
First, let me say about Paul in the Gospels. I mean, Paul is not ignorant about the historical Jesus. I mean, I don't know how anybody could say that. He quotes him several times, and he refers to he talks about his crucifixion all the time. I mean, Paul is not ignorant.
Could Paul have known historical information about Jesus? Sure, he could have. Paul couldn't say that he knew any historical information about Jesus because that would be antithetical to his apostleship claim. Nowhere in any of Paul's epistles does Paul say that he knew historical information about Jesus. In order to make this argument, Dr. Bart Ehrman has to ignore key verses in Paul or reinterpret them in ways that's just simply illogical, much like an apologist would do. If you consider how apologists argue that slavery in the Old Testament was always ever indentured servitude and that it was voluntary, you'll understand what I'm meaning here. The apologists that do that operate in the exact same way that Bart Ehrman is operating here. And that is not normally how Bart Ehrman operates in other subjects. A prime example in this particular context is Galatians 1:11. And that's when Paul claims that he didn't get his information from any human on earth. He only got it through visions in scripture. Bart either has to reinterpret this in an illogical way or he just straight up ignores it. Speculating that Paul had historical information about Jesus is purely hypothetical information. Bart is the one who has claimed that we have extensive evidence for the historicity of Jesus, and I'm just saying that there's not.
But you're the one who's claiming that there's early extensive evidence. I'm simply saying that there's not.
And yet again, Bart Ehrman building his entire case out of hypothetical information that we cannot know is seriously faulty. So it seems like whenever a piece of hypothetical information suits Bart Ehrman's needs, he will not treat it as though it's hypothetical information, but will treat it as proven fact. He does this for the supposed early attestation of Jesus, Josephus's evidence, and Paul's information. But remember, this is not normal for Bart. Bart does not do this when he is discussing the resurrection, textual reliability of the New Testament, or even the Gospels. Why, when it comes to Jesus' existence, does Dr. Bart Ehrman accept arguments that he would normally reject? I'm totally baffled. But I would love to know what you heathens think down in the comments below. Be sure to go down there and let me know what you think about Bart Ehrman and his arguments for the historical Jesus. Do you think that they're seriously faulty? Or do you think that he might have good evidence for Jesus' existence? Let me know down below in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of information. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.